Hello to all the attendees. Just so you know, your lines are muted. And we're excited to see you here. Thanks for watching our presentation. Please be aware that Advice Chaser, the host of this webinar, is not a registered investment advisor. Advice Chaser cannot and does not give financial advice. This recording is for educational purposes only and cannot be considered advice for any person's individual situation. Advice Chaser regularly hosts informative webinars similar to this recording, featuring a variety of knowledgeable professionals, many of whom are licensed advisors. Any opinions, ideas, or principles expressed by presenters are their own, and however true or interesting, are not endorsed by Advice Chaser. Please do not act on the information in this recording without consulting a qualified financial professional. Our thanks to the many subject matter experts who generously give of their time to make this material accessible to our followers. So we're thrilled to bring you this educational presentation today. Again, attendees are muted, but we do encourage you to ask questions using the chat box down at the bottom of your screen. The presenters will answer those queries during or after the webinar today as appropriate. If you ask a question in the chat box, go ahead and leave your contact information as well. If we can't get to your questions during the event, we'll make sure someone reaches out to you after. We want this experience to be as educational as possible, so please don't hesitate to ask for clarification or expansion of the material. And I'd like to introduce you to today's moderator, Mark Seither. He's a partner and wealth manager with Kingsview Partners in Knoxville, Tennessee. Mark has a Bachelor of Arts in Economics from San Diego State University and began working as a financial advisor for Northwestern Mutual in La Jolla. Mark enjoyed finding innovative solutions to clients' complex problems, and his desire to work with the entrepreneurial-minded helped him to thrive as a financial advisor. As Mark honed his skills, he looked for a platform that would better pair with his desire to work with clients needing advanced planning and specialized fixes. He found his spot back in Northern California in early 2017 when he joined Trust CFO and assisted in integrating complex tax and estate planning with wealth and investment management. Since then, he has collaborated with Josh Saunders, a retired Navy and current Southwest pilot, to build Kingsview Partners. Together, they assist individuals on wealth management and tax strategies, specializing in the needs of pilots. And our presenter today is James O'Neill. He's the founder and owner of Raven Careers, which provides aviation professionals with the resources to successfully develop their careers. As an ATP certified pilot with type ratings in King Air 300, Citation Sovereign, and Embraer 170-190 aircraft, James understands pilots and the many challenges they can experience during their careers. During the economic downturn of 2010, James used a furlough to perfect his career planning, strategy, networking, interviewing, and negotiating skills, leading to multiple interviews with Fortune 500 flight departments throughout the United States. His success in this arena led him to create Raven Career Development. The business grew by word of mouth and clientele expanded as additional services were added. Raven's client base has now grown to cross multiple continents and specializes in helping military, corporate, and airline pilots get their number one flying job. So, Mark, do you want to start moderation and launch us here?
Yes, I will. Thank you very much. We're very excited to have James on. James is actually on our podcast involving entrepreneurs because he is an entrepreneur himself, and then Josh can't be with us today because he is one of James's victims of being counseled and transitioned from his job as a corporate pilot into Southwest. So. If that's a testimony to, at least one success of James's, that's why he's not here today. Very excited to have him on. Some of the information that he had on our podcast, we did identify as like, hey, this would actually be really good to just share with other pilots, which is why we wanted to bring him on here. So James, thank you so much for being on.
Yeah, man. Thank you for having me.
Yeah, perfect. Well, let's get going. First thing first, Megan, if you want to shift the slide here. So regarding your dream pilot job, I mean, in the podcast, you had gone into like, hey, there's different variations of being a pilot. And, you'd kind of talked about a few examples of like, hey, some people think they're looking for this, and it turns out, hey, you're really not a good fit for that kind of pilot job. So can you walk us through your process initially of just, hey, how do you, when someone approaches you about, hey, I want to transition, how do you approach identifying what they're going to be a good fit for, or at least checking off like, hey, this is what you hate, so you're definitely going to hate this type of job?
Sure. So it's actually gotten a lot harder recently. This used to be a very easy conversation. I mean, if you think right after September 11th, the airlines weren't hiring, you just needed a job flying airplanes, right? So pretty much most people were going into corporate. When you take a look at previous to September 11th, the late 90s, everybody was going to the airlines because that's kind of what the thing was. And now here we are post coronavirus. And pretty much if you're a pilot, you can go work anywhere you want to. And a lot of folks think like, hey, that's great. I want more options. But it's kind of like when you go into Home Depot and you decide, hey, I think I want to repaint my bedroom. And you go, hey, can you guys show me some swatches of blue paint? And they bring out 7,600 different types of colors of blue. And you're like, I didn't want that many choices. I really wanted like 3, maybe 4, right? And that's a situation that everybody's in right now. They're getting 7,600 choices of blue, right? Literally any type of flying you want to do right now. With the proper networking, with the proper resume, with the proper interview prep and salary negotiation, you can pretty much make the job you want right now. Well, the problem is people are getting overloaded. They're going into kind of the pilot seizure, right? Of should I do this or should I do that? And the reason why they're getting overloaded is because it's really stressful when you're making a multi-million-dollar decision that's going to impact your family, because most people are struggling to make sure they're making the right decision. Mm-hmm. So there are a couple of different factors that we go through to start the conversation of what might be a good fit for you. And believe it or not, in this conversation, the easiest thing to do is start by eliminating things first, not by finding out what you want to do. Because it turns out there's a lot of things people can talk themselves into doing. But if you start really anchoring with what do you not want to do, you can start pulling different types of colors of blue off the table. So first we look at is type of flying. Do you like international? Do you like domestic? Do you like the concept of a set schedule where you know what you're doing all the time, or do you like going to different destinations, right? That type of flying matters. If when you wake up in the morning, you never got to fly a wide body aircraft international, would you care, right? If the answer is yes, then you're likely going to either become an airline pilot or you're going into the military to fly some type of freighter. Okay, after we go through type of flying, then we take a look at advancement opportunities. Does becoming a captain matter to you? For some people it does, for some people it doesn't. Does having responsibilities outside the cockpit matter? Do you want to become an assistant chief pilot, a chief pilot, some type of management person? Do you want to get involved in a union and move higher up that way? These outside the cockpit opportunities are going to vary depending on the company that you choose. And especially when we have folks that have spent a lot of time outside the cockpit, either in management positions or in union positions, now they're making that big jump to the next company. And certain companies are going to have much better avenues available to them than others. After that, we take a look at schedule, quality of life. Do you want to set schedule? Do you not want to set schedule? Do you want to fly 5 to 7 days a month? Do you want to fly 12 to 18 days a month? What do you want that schedule to look like? Would you want to do 30 on, 30 off, 17 on, 13 off? A lot of people think in terms of this, like, 4 or 5 days flying, 2 or 3 days at home. But there are people out there that like extended times of period at home. And so some of these non-traditional schedules end up fitting best for them. And then the last is the one that everyone always talks about, finances. How much am I being paid? What does my retirement look like? What do my health benefits look like? That's going to be a different consideration if you're in your early 20s than if in your late 50s, right? It's going to be a lot different if you're in your late 50s and you have 3 or 4 million sitting in your 401k, or if in your late 50s and you have 100,000 sitting in your 401k. And so those are kind of the different variables that we start with to help people pull options off the table and then start to narrow in on what are the different variables that are actually going to matter to them and their families.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, perfect. And then, because background matters too. And I know you've helped, you've done some career counseling with people who are, post-military, right? And Megan, if you want to go to the next slide, people who are transitioning from that, hey, I was in the military, I've got all these flying hours, where do I go next, right? So how do you kind of walk people through like, well, this is what you're used to, and here's what's out there that's really advantageous for, like a typical post-military pilot?
Yeah, and with the military people, typically there are a couple of questions that we ask up front. So number one, are you getting a full military retirement or not? Because if they did 20 years in the military and they're coming out with TRICARE and they've got a pension, right? They tend to be a little more free over, I can do whatever I want, right? If they did a 10 or 11 year military career, right? And now their retirement is really primarily going to be based on whatever they do in civilian life. It's a little bit of a different consideration. The other thing is, do they have any time in the Guard or the reserves, right? Or are they going to stay flying in the Guard or the reserves? Though that will tend to vary what a military person's transition looks like. The other thing we have to look at, and this typically happens when, depending on what the different folks' track were in the military, is some folks end up in non-flying positions for the last year or 2 or 3 of their military career. And so when they're coming out, they may not be current flying wise. And so they're trying to figure out, okay, if I want to go back into the cockpit, how far out do I need to start planning and what do I need to start thinking about? So typically, if someone has been out of the cockpit towards the end of their military career for anywhere between 1 and 3 years, we typically recommend they start their transition planning about 18 months out. And the reason for that is one of the components of their transition plan is likely going to be something called Skill Bridge. And if folks are not familiar with what that is, it's a program the Department of Defense puts on where you can effectively do an internship with a civilian company where your salary is paid for by the military. It usually overlaps with their terminal leave, but they can use that to get recurrent. There are a number of corporate operators that will take them. There's a number of flight instructor positions that will take them, but they can get that 100 hours or so in the remaining time of their military career. So about 18 months out is the appropriate time to start planning that, because they not only have to figure out what is their end destination, but they got to start networking with different companies who may be able to use them in an internship type program. Now, if you're leaving the military and you're currently flying, that typically the transition starts at about the 12-month time frame. 12 months out, they're starting to take a look at getting their resume put together. They're starting to take a look at converting their military logbooks to civilian. We work with Anytime Logbooks, Mark Stuffelbeam and his team to help military folks convert over. Different civilian companies want a military conversion. Other civilian companies do not want a military conversion. So getting their logbooks put together, getting their resume put together, gathering all of their performance reviews to start putting into the application and the resume, starting to run background checks on themselves. Do they have speeding tickets, or do they have any arrests on their record, or do they have any DUIs on their record, or do they have any stage check failures or check ride failures? All that stuff that, believe it or not, people forget about. You want to have copies of that so you know what you need to disclose, because we always advocate disclosing openly and honestly. And then as we get within about that 6-month range between when they're leaving the military, that's usually when their interviews are getting scheduled. So now we're looking at interview prep. Prior to that, we're looking at different networking things like going to job fairs and getting on LinkedIn and so on and so forth. So about 18 months out for someone who is in a non-flying position or leaving from a non-flying position in the military, about 12 months out if they are in a flying position. Because believe it or not, it takes time to go to the government and get your records. They don't give those to you quickly, right? Then you get the record and you're like, oh man, this wasn't documented correctly. Or, hey, I know I had this issue, but the way my instructor documented it was different, right? It takes time to go through all that and get that squared away. And the airlines in particular, by the way, know what the timeline is between when they're going to interview you and when you're going to be in class. So if you're updating your application, it's not like they're going to call you to interview the day you're leaving the military. They're going to back that up They could call you 6-9 months out, right? 3-6 months out, depending on the airline, and start bringing you in and interviewing you because they want the day you leave the military, the next day to be the day you start with them.
Yeah. And real quick, not to get, I wouldn't really say it's off topic. It's just, you'd mentioned that skill bridge. I know you had done a podcast on that specifically. Can you give us a small insight just on what was contained in that podcast in case anyone wants more information on like, hey, that's me. I need some more information.
So if you check out the Raven Careers Aviation podcast, you'll see an episode on Skill Bridge, and there's a couple different components to it. So you can have a company that you want to do this internship with that has not been approved for a Skill Bridge program. So we talked about that. You have a company you want to do an internship with. They've decided they want to have you be an intern with them. How do you get them approved to give you that internship? Mm-hmm. So that was the first big thing that we talked about. The second big thing that we talked about is how do you get your command structure to agree to let you do that skill bridge, right? Different structures within the military will be receptive. Others may be resistant towards letting you do that skill bridge, especially if they can't backfill your slot while you're doing that skill bridge. And so they're basically losing a person. So that was the second component. And then the third component was, okay, so you have a company, we talked about companies that were not approved, getting them approved, getting your command structure to agree. Then how do you find the existing companies that are out there that already are approved? And so it's kind of start to finish. It's a really interesting podcast. We've got an 06 from the Navy on there. We've got a gentleman from Department of Defense, Pentagon, who ran the program on there that are talking you through all the back end components of how it works. And it's this really cool program that, to be honest, when we tell people, they're like, that's too good to be true. What's the catch? And you're like, there isn't one. It actually is that good. So SkillBridge is a pretty awesome program for folks leaving.
Awesome. So that's, that's a good overview of, people transitioning out of the military. As far as, sometimes landing the big commercial airlines seems to be a dream job, but people want to transition out of it. What's been your experience for people who get into, let's say, that Southwest or United job, and it's like, I think I want to fly. Something smaller. I think I want to fly. Just get out of this industry. I still want to fly.
Yeah. So typically, where we see that is when folks are towards the end of their airline career, right? So you're talking about the age 60 to 65, or they have some type of medical situation where they leave the cockpit for a period of time and something changes. The value that corporate aviation brings to folks is a couple different things. Number one, you're not necessarily restricted to the bases the airlines have. So there's certain areas in the Midwest, certain areas on the West Coast, certain areas throughout the country that if you want to live there, corporate aviation is going to give you a significantly better quality of life. You want to live in Montana, right? Corporate aviation may give you a better quality of life depending on the corporate operator that you're targeting. So that's number one. Number two, in corporate aviation, when you go from job to job to job, you don't go to the bottom of the pay scale. Your pay stays relatively even, right? So in the airlines, you're going to start out low, you're going to end high. In corporate, you're going to kind of stay right in that middle area the entire time. You're not going to make, there's a corporate guy out there making $400,000 a year, so, right? But he's a statistical anomaly, right? You're not going to make $400,000 a year flying corporate, but you also, you're not going to make 70 or 100 flying corporate either. You're going to sit in that, 180 to 250 range, let's say, as of today. Tomorrow, with the way everything's going, double those numbers, I don't know, right? But what happens is you kind of stay in that level area right in between. Now, if you're one of those folks on the civilian side that just, your finances are really well put together, you don't have to catch up for any type of medical issues your family may have suffered or the downturn in 2008 or 2001, right? That middle zone is perfect. Get to live where you want to live. Salary is really, really great. You may only work 10, 12 days a month, depending on, who you're flying for. It could be less depending on the account. But when you get into those scenarios, those are typically the niche scenarios where quality of life is becomes a little bit higher of a priority, and you have somehow figured out how to get your family to survive on $250,000 a year, which I know is tough, everybody, but you can slum along and figure it out. So.
Awesome. And then, this next, the next category of someone who's trying to get into that, into that big commercial space, right? I think, it's fairly obvious. I mean, we can go into it a little bit as to why people are attracted to that, but also, do you have, you've put out some information on just like the need for pilots right now. Can you give us like, hey, here's who this is a good fit for, but also like, here's the need in the corporate, or I mean, in the commercial airline space?
Yeah, I mean, if you take a look at just the major airlines right now, right, United, Delta, American, Southwest, FedEx, UPS, they're going to hire about 9,500 pilots in 2022. I mean, that's astounding. You're talking there's like 22 or 25,000 regional pilots in the United States, if I remember correctly. Somebody fact check that. I'm slightly off. I apologize, but that's the number I can remember off the top of my head. So the quantity of pilots that are being hired is staggering. I mean, it's insane. And there's a couple of different reasons for that, right? We already had the age 65 thing where age 65 pilots were set to retire in high numbers in this decade. But then we early retired them out during the coronavirus because airlines were bleeding cash left and right. And flight school enrollment went almost to zero during coronavirus. So we were not producing new pilots. We were retiring pilots out early. And now all of a sudden we have this massive recovery where everybody wants. Turns out when you lock people inside their houses for 2 years, they want to travel. I don't know why. So now we have this kind of like collision of factors coming together. The reality is there's a lot of people that call us that go, hey man, I have opportunities on the table, either in the airlines or in corporate. And they're like, I just never thought that would ever be a reality. I mean, guys in their 40s and 50s, they're like, I never thought I'd be able to do what I'm able to do now. What should I do? And so the corporate to airline guys, there's typically maybe three reasons on why they're doing that. One of them is, look, they need to schedule for their families. Right. There's a lot of corporate operators that do not provide a steady enough schedule. And so they may love the flying. They may love the person that they're flying for. They may even love the airplane that they're flying. But look, if you have a spouse, if you have children, right, your kids don't care what you fly. They care that you made the T-ball game. They care that you make birthday parties. They care that you're there for Christmas. They do not care. They don't understand mommy or daddy flies a, Challenger 350. Ooh, they don't. That means nothing to them, right? Okay, or a Gulfstream or whatever. So that schedule becomes really, really important. Mm-hmm. The second thing becomes really, really important is the retirement. It's basically automatic, right? They're taking 15 to 17% of your income and giving it to you in a retirement account. Now you have to choose the accounts on where you're going to put that money in, and you guys are the experts on that, not me. So I am not about to tread water into what you should do with your long-term financial savings. But when you take a look at the airlines, right, you don't have to figure out how am I going to take my $150 or $200 or $250,000 a year or $100,000 a year salary and carve money out of that to save for my retirement. They're giving it to you. And you're talking about really great travel privileges, so you can take your family around, around the world. Great healthcare, right? So it kind of boils down to schedule, quality of life, and pay. Those are the three things.
Yeah.
Now, sometimes you'll get people that are like, hey, look, I really want to fly a 777 internationally. But the schedule, quality of life, and pay are the three predominant ones that really pop up for people.
Uh-huh. Got it. And so those are, it's a good summation of just, where people might be going into the aviation industry. I know when we were diving into your business on our podcast, you spent a bit of time on resumes and, the surprisingly little amount of time people, recruiters spend on resumes, and how resumes are really just data points. So I want to camp out there just a little bit. I think first of all, if you could tell us why you offer writing resumes, but often talk people out of it, I think that's a good place to start with just your opinions on resumes and how they should be utilized.
Yeah. So look, my perspective, your resume is the beginning of the salary negotiation, right? So if you have a well-written resume, it is not just talking about data points. It's not just talking about I held this position for this period of time. I had this position title. I have this much flight time. I have this much ratings. Those are what we call qualifiers, right? I can't tell you how many times pilots put on their resume, 15 years of accident incident-free flying. That's like me being a surgeon and going, I haven't killed one of my patients yet. You're like, I kind of expected that, right? Like that's kind of the entry point, right? That's not a selling point. You know what I'm saying? Or a chef being like, I haven't had anyone get food poisoning yet. You're like, thank you. I appreciate that. I kind of expected you would not give me rancid food, right? But it's hard for people like pilots to think, hey, how do I add value, right? They don't think about, hey, I may not have held a specific title in my company, but I did rewrite a manual, or I helped rewrite a manual, or I provided feedback to redesign some procedures, or I, unofficially mentored a bunch of people, right? And when you start putting those, what we call differentiators on a resume, now, yeah, a recruiter may be only spending 6 to 8 seconds reviewing your resume, but when they bring you into the interview, you have things you can point to that you can use to create urgency on the part of the person interviewing you. Because if they have one of those problems and you've convinced them you can solve it, you just raised how much you're worth. And that's really important, because you don't want at the end of an interview someone saying yes because it's the best we can get. You want someone saying yes because they're excited that you're the one coming in the door, because there's something you're going to do that makes their life easier or their organization better.
Yeah. And, because you had mentioned like, hey, resumes, they're really just kind of a quick review. Networking is really where it's at, and being able to approach whether it's a recruiter or an HR staff, and making sure that, they're pulling your resume. Because if you just send it in, cross your fingers.
That's precisely correct. So your resume is sitting in a stack of resumes, right? It's kind of like, from a business perspective, owning a website. If you think you're going to have a website and magically people are going to go find it and they're going to call you up and want to spend money with your business, that's not going to happen. Your website is something you drive people back to after they've seen some other type of information from you. In this case, that's networking, right? So we network to build a relationship, to get a conversation started, to get ourselves on the recruiter's radar, to drive them back to the resume. And if we do a good job during the networking, what will happen is we've discussed some of those value adds. So now when they go back to your resume, they know what they're looking for. They're looking for very specific items on that resume based on problems that they have. So, we're taught a couple of things as children, right? Don't ever interrupt, right? Don't bother people, and answer every question that you're asked. And networking is all about interrupting people, not answering every question you're asked, and bothering people. But you have to do it in a polite and respectful way. So the example that I like to use is, let's say you're walking down the street and you're lost and you can't find out where you want to go. And you're in this really, really, really stressed situation, and you're trying to figure out, hey, I'm trying to find where that bus stop is. If I interrupt you, right, initially that may be seen as irritating or a disturbance, or may make you unhappy. But if 30 seconds in, I identify that you're lost and tell you the exact directions on how to get to where you want to go, you're actually really thankful I interrupted you and bothered you, because I solved your problem. And that's the trick to networking. That's why we call it being politely persistent, right? You don't want to cross that line. You don't want to be impolite. You don't want to be crass. You don't want to be rude. But there are some very skillful ways that that you can interrupt people. I'm in Washington, D.C. right now. We're doing a little family vacation, and I was walking by the Washington Monument, and there was a guy there with a whole bunch of like T-shirts and hats and everything. And he goes, "Sir, we're giving these away." And I went, "Hey, it's okay, man. I'm completely fine." And he did not stop talking when I interrupted him. He went, "Sir, this is one of only thousands remaining," right? He got my attention. He did something funny, right? He was persistent. He didn't stop. Now, he didn't walk up to me. He didn't block my path. He didn't curse. He wasn't rude. He wasn't crass. He made eye contact the whole time. He was smiling. He was obviously joking. But we took this perfect situation where I'm walking, right? Not thinking I want a hat or anything. And he was able to interrupt me and get a conversation started and get me to walk over and listen to his products and what he was selling and what he's offering just by being funny, right? Mm-hmm. That's the trick to networking. You have to create something that hooks someone's attention. And when they try and interrupt you and get you to stop, find a politely persistent way to engage them in a conversation and get them to want to talk to you. And we have a lot of very specific ways to do that that are very simple, very repeatable. So simple and repeatable that when people do it, or when we teach it to people, they're like, you've got to be kidding me. There's no way that's actually going to work. And then they do it, and then they're calling up panicking a week later going, I have an interview set up. You know, like, did you think I was kidding? Like, I mean, you know, it works.
Well, and because I think this is one of the ways, because you had walked through like the disarming honesty approach, right, on our podcast. Could you give us a little bit of, you know, how you use that, or how you coach people to use that to hook people into interviews, or get recruiters interested?
Yeah, I don't dance around. I mean, you know, I'll tell someone, hey, I'm going to bother you for 30 seconds and then I'm going to walk away. And they're thinking in their head, I could let you bother me for 30 seconds, or I could try and get you to stop, which is going to take longer than 30 seconds, right? I've got you in a trap. What I've said is listen to what I'm about to say for 30 seconds and then I'll leave, right? Now, I've got to have something to give you in 30 seconds that engages you. But, you know, it's disarming honesty, because do you expect someone to walk up to you and go, I'm going to bother you. I'm going to interrupt you for 30 seconds and then I'm going to walk away and leave you alone. You're like, oh, I mean, you knew I was going to do that, but the fact that I'm being honest builds trust inside of 3 seconds. Now I have to have something in 30 seconds, right? Hey, Mark, one question for you, right? Okay, so I'm choosing between these 3 things in my retirement. I know you're really, really busy right now. Is now a good time for you to answer that question, or should I book with you to talk later? Book with me to talk later. How do I do that? Here's my number. Cool. I'll call you in a week. That's it. Done. That was my 30-second interaction. But guess what? A week later, hey, I'm that guy that bothered you at lunch that said I was going to walk away in 30 seconds. We promised we would talk in a week. It's been a week. Can I set up a time to talk to you? And you're going, oh, I remember you. Right? Mm-hmm. You know, I did something that was memorable. I was polite. I was persistent. Positive association on your end. I didn't BS you. Mm-hmm. But even though I've just told you this, most people are thinking, yeah, but how do I do that in aviation? Well, you have to know how recruiters think. You have to know per company what's going on, which we do because we're staying in touch with them constantly, and tell you, okay, here's when to interrupt them, how to interrupt them, here's what's going to be responsive. And it's not boilerplate. It's not like we have 1,000 people doing the same thing. It's tailored to your normal voice, your normal tone, your normal way of doing things. Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
So, but it's effective.
Yes. I mean, simple things like that, where you're just, like you said, like, oh my gosh, does that seriously work? But it is kind of, you know, the psychology behind it is really funny, right? Like the whole, like, hey, I'm going to bother you for 30 seconds. Like, yeah, all right, well, I can hold my breath for 30 seconds. So yeah, let's
you're like, so you told that guy you were going to bother him and walk away and he let you do it? I'm like, well, yeah, of course he did. What else is he going to do? He's going to take him 45 seconds to argue with me. It was going to take him 30 seconds to listen, right? And they're just like, you've got to be kidding. There's no way that works. Fine. Go walk to that person right there and go try it. And they do it. And they're like, that worked. I know. You can go do that 1,000 more times today and it will work 999 times. If it's not simple and repeatable, it's not worth anything. Mm-hmm. You got to remember, pilots are pilots. Financial people are financial people. Pilots are not professional networkers, right? That's not what they do for a living. They fly airplanes. So we have to design tactics and techniques for people that don't do this naturally, that don't do this normally, and simplify it so they can repeat it. And be themselves. They can't be unnatural. They can't have to pretend. It's got to be natural to them.
Yeah. Now let's shift over to another form of networking that I find to be for most people, I think, find to be kind of a ginormous mess.
Sure.
Right. I mean, LinkedIn. You know, for all the good that it does, sometimes, you know, I hate that I get like 20 notifications. I just found out how to turn off certain ones, and it's like, oh, 19 of them have nothing to do with me. Right.
Yep.
And so how do you coach people into utilizing, hey, here's how you use LinkedIn effectively to actually get the result you want, not just check in on, the latest, market updates?
Sure. So I'm going to use a fancy term that some of the pilots may be familiar with, but it's something called systematic desensitization. Okay. So if you're a pilot, you remember the first time you got in an airplane and they gave, in a twin engine airplane, they gave you an engine failure, right? And it's like, oh my God, I'm going to die, right? And what we do as instructors is we just give you that engine failure over and over and over and over and over and over and over until all of a sudden we've trained the fear out. And now what happens is you have an engine failure and you go, oh, if I do these 3 things, everything's going to be completely fine. And then eventually, as you get more experience, you have an engine failure and you go, man, I'm going to be late for dinner. Because you're so sure that you're going to survive the engagement, it's not even stressful to you. Okay, so that's systematic desensitization. You put someone through something over and over and over that creates high stress, stops creating high stress. Well, guess what? In LinkedIn, if I want to start a conversation with you, Mark, I can go read the different things on your profile and the different things that you're interested in, the different things that you talk about, and I can start writing content that I can then put in front of you. You don't have to pay any extra for it. There's no secret tricks. There's just some hashtags and some different types of techniques that you can learn. And what happens is I can write content that you're interested in and put it in front of you twice a week for about a month straight. And then guess what? When I reach out to you, remember that example I used earlier where I had to say, hey, 30 seconds, I'm going to bother you and then leave you alone? That was a situation where you had no idea who I am. You've never come in contact with me before. LinkedIn now creates a scenario where you've seen me day after day after day for a month. Now, when I reach out to start a conversation, you're way more likely as a recruiter to talk to me because you've read some interesting articles that I've shared. I've written 1 or 2 sentences about a topic that is interesting, that caught your attention. And so LinkedIn, you can take an active approach, right, which is reaching out to people directly and doing that, hey, 30 seconds and I'll leave you alone thing, which don't actually do it that way on LinkedIn. It won't work. Just want to make sure I hope that was clear before, but I just wanted to make sure nobody actually tries that because that one won't work on LinkedIn, I promise you. But the other thing is when you're having people that are really difficult to get in contact with, we can show you tricks on how to put content in front of them. And to be honest, you don't even have to write a lot of it. Most of it is just actually grabbing articles and cutting portions of the article out. And you can use some different algorithm tricks that a 3rd grader can do. I mean, this is not advanced stuff, right? Simple and repeatable. And what happens is you desensitize that recruiter to your presence around them, and they are way more likely to have a conversation with you.
Yeah. So, and just, because obviously sometimes that's like, hey, that sounds great in theory, but I know, and we can leave names out, but I know on our podcast, you talked about a success case where you're like, hey, this guy was not a spring chicken. He was not, he was in his 50s.
Yeah.
Can you tell me a little, how quickly were you able to get him from A to B? And just the whole process of like, hey, he did not have a LinkedIn, and now he's super popular on LinkedIn.
Yeah, so he's actually not even super popular on LinkedIn. He's just super effective. Most of you wouldn't be able to find him if you tried to. That's the funny thing about it. This is like, yeah, it took 2 weeks to write his profile. It took a week to do the course, probably took another 30 or 45 days of him actually going on. So let's call it 2 to 3 months. Mm-hmm. Now, he got a job at one of the what are called ACMI carriers, right? That's your Kalitta, Atlas, Omni, National. Got hired. He used it to transition straight out of the military into one of those, and I don't even think he was there a year, and now he's at FedEx. So, it was just, real quick.
Yeah.
But it was effective because he used an article. And that actually got a recruiter to reach out to him. Mm-hmm. The other funny thing that people don't realize is if you're on LinkedIn and you follow the recruiters, you're going to get a notification that says, blah, 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 just promoted, blah, 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 just changed jobs. Write them a congratulations message really, really quick. Don't click the canned LinkedIn one. But if you're like, hey, I noticed you just took a new job at XYZ airline. Congratulations. If you don't mind me asking, what precipitated the jump? You'll get a conversation. What do you like most? What do you like least? How's it been? Did you move? What's the new city like?
And that's that's not with recruiters. That's for other pilots, or is that when recruiters
No,
switch
I
jobs?
do it with recruiters all the time. You can do it with chief pilots. You can do it with pilots. You can do it with everybody. I mean,
and the beautiful thing about that is you're asking people to talk about themselves, which most people love.
Right. If any of you need to prove it, ravencareers.com, 614-379-2351. That's my direct number. Call me up and tell me, James, I think you're an amazing person. Can you tell me more about it and block out an hour? Because I'm going to talk. The trick is you talk to people about them. Right? We love hearing about ourselves. We all do. Right? You can lie, you can tell yourself, oh, I'm not like that. Watch. Go to a party, have someone ask, so what do you do for a living? And time yourself talking for 45 minutes, right? We love talking about ourselves. So give people an opportunity to do it. Right? And guess what? The cool thing is when you use that technique, we all, each of us has a different internal clock, but we eventually get to a point where we go, man, I've been talking about myself for a really long time. They will automatically swap over and start asking you questions about you. So it's really easy. You don't have to worry about it. They will ask you about you. Might take 10 minutes, might take 7 minutes, might take 20 minutes, but they will ask you about you. So talk to them about them. Very effective and fun.
And now kind of, transitioning to when people do have to talk about themselves in the interviewing process, right? And this is where, some people get, a bit nervous in that interview process, right? Because you're having to really position yourself against everyone else. What are some of your things you coach people through preparation wise, or talk, unique factors about themselves that you're like, hey, you got to bring these things up. You gotta, this is how you stand out.
Yeah, sure. So like pretty much anybody that offers interview prep or service also says the same thing, right? We're not going to have you go unscripted. That's great. How do you do that? Right? Because like 90% of them are going to give you a script. That's what they're going to do. And there's a couple of tricks on how you can walk into an interview and not be scripted. So the first one is you have to be really familiar with your own background, what problems you are good at solving and what problems you are not good at solving, right? And the reason is because when the recruiter asks certain questions, if you are really familiar with your background, you can drive the conversation naturally into positive directions. Now, a lot of pilots go, well, hey, what do you mean problems I can solve? Well, reliability is one. Are you going to quit and go someplace else? Are you going to pass my training program? Do you have international experience? There's a lot of things pilots bring to the table that they take for granted that are actually really valuable to companies. Because guess what? If you don't make it through their training program, that costs them 50 grand per person, right? If they send you through training and then all of a sudden you're atrocious in your first year and nobody likes flying with you, there's all these costs that add up of people trying to get out of flying with you. Okay, so that's number one, is being very familiar with your background. That's why during the introduction, it's not about teaching you how to script yourself. We literally are asking you questions over the course of about an hour and going, okay, this thing over here, I know that sounds like something you wouldn't normally talk about. Here's how you want to weave that in. This thing over here that seems really small to you, it's actually really big. Here's why. So you go in with a very clear picture on what of my background is interesting, what is not, and then it just naturally flows in your own voice and tone because you're talking about things you're familiar with. It's yourself. Okay. The second thing is you have to have a group of stories that talk about different skill sets you have. And the skill sets are really emotionally intelligence based, right? So problem solving, conflict resolution, emotional regulation. Can you get into a situation where someone's in your face and not get reactive? Can you, when a passenger is screaming at a flight attendant, can the first thing you do not be, sir, I can have you arrested, right? Can you emotionally regulate yourself through? What motivates you? What gets you up in the morning? So there's different areas like that where we're intentionally helping you pick out stories that show those different areas of emotional intelligence. And a good story won't show just one of them. It'll show conflict resolution, motivation, and problem solving, right? It'll show motivation and empathy, right? So we're trying to find stories that hit multiple of them. And then really all you're doing is sitting back and And as they're asking you questions, because you're walking in with 5, 6, or 7 stories, every one of those stories will fit. You're just trying to pick which one's the best one. And then lastly, you have to get very good, and we talk about this extensively. How do you watch body language during the interview? You're looking for very subtle things like what you just did where you were nodding your head, right? So those are what we call minimal encouragers. You're looking for, you know what, this person's been writing at this pace the entire time and all of a sudden it's slowed down or it's sped up. Did they stop writing? Did they have a concern? Look, like there's a lot of subtle things that you can look at from people body language wise where you can go, something changed. Because then you can interrupt and ask, I'm sorry, when I just explained that, was I clear or did I go on a tangent? Oh, you actually lost me over there. Oh, okay, cool, let me go back, right? But you can watch the body language, and when you get the positive stuff, you dive into it. If it starts changing and you're not getting the reception that you thought you wanted, you can start changing directions, or you can ask them, hey, is there something I'm saying that, there's a lot of different tricks you can use to get the interview back on track. But you are always going to walk into an interview without knowing some piece of information, what they're struggling with, why it's affecting them negatively, how it's affecting them negatively, right? So most people are guessing when they walk in the interview. We don't really want you guessing in the interview. We want you using their body language and their feedback. What questions do they ask you? What questions don't they ask you? And when you start learning how to cue into those things, you become very adaptive in the interview as opposed to very structured or very rigid, if that makes sense.
Man, I'm gonna have to go back and watch this and see what other subtle cues I did. I'm feeling like I'm being analyzed. I'm glad you followed up with like, oh, you're nodding your head like that. That means you're actively listening.
And those are called minimal encouragers. We're looking for them all the time. Like, nodding their head. Like I said, one of them that's really subtle that people miss is the speed the person is writing. Right? They're talking, so they're thinking through their story. They're not watching the recruiter, right? They're not watching, is the recruiter smiling? Is the recruiter frowning? There's a lot of these subtle cues that while you're talking, you really want to be zoned in on the body language of that person. And I've given you some easy ones, but there's some other ones that are really subtle that once someone tells you, like, how have I not been looking at that the entire time? But you'll miss him if you're not looking for him.
I'm just glad that you pointed out it was a good thing. You weren't like, oh, you're nodding your head. That means you're dummy. Low IQ.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Well, so that's actually, one of the things that pilots don't realize is there's civilian recruiters in the room that don't have any aviation experience. And you can watch their body language where they very clearly don't understand what you're talking about. And they're not going to say that out loud. Mm-hmm. So you can start asking them questions or reframing what you're doing or simplifying your language, because don't ever put a recruiter in a position in an interview and you go, I'm sorry, what you just said was really, really complex. I have no idea what you're talking about. Can you dumb it down for me? They're not going to do that. They're just going to go, oh yeah, and walk out the door and go, I have no idea what that guy said. No. Mm-hmm. It's exactly what's going to happen.
Yeah.
So that body language becomes really important.
Yeah. So, because we're about to move into the Q&A portion, and we've had a couple questions come in, but before we start addressing them, I wanted to touch on one thing, because on your podcast, you had the former Spirit CEO on, and you guys were talking about post-COVID aviation.
Sure.
And, it seems like we are in this weird time where, let go of a bunch of pilots, trying to get a bunch hired right now. People are booking flights they want to travel. Are there any changes you're seeing just in the aviation community or aviation industry that's a result of COVID?
Yeah, I mean, it goes back to what I said earlier, which is because of that acceleration of retirements and reduction in people starting flight training, what most pilots are looking at right now is all the money that's on the table. And there's a lot of it. And there's a lot more that sounds like might be coming. What they're not looking at is once you get into the job and once you get settled in 9 months, a year, it's a routine, right? At what point is getting that money thrown at you not matter to your family? Because you're gone 20 days or 30 days or 40 days, or you're really only getting a day or two at home. And so that's the stuff that a lot of folks need to start thinking about is what is their time worth? Because there's a certain point where the money actually reduces in value, right? You get hit with a tax bill at the end of the year that's a little higher than you expected. And you're like, man, I really wish I took that time off.
Yeah.
You miss enough birthday parties and Christmases. There is a point where the money actually loses value. And, if you're in your 30s or 40s, you have, God, let's say you're in your 20s, right? You could have anywhere between 20 and 40 years of this left. This is a marathon, not a sprint, right? So you got to really think through what's going to be right for your family. And that shift is happening so quick that people are not mentally prepared for it. They're also getting multiple job offers from multiple legacy airlines. We are consistently having clients get hired by 2 to 3 legacy airlines at the same time. They were not ready for that. How do you go home to your family and you're like, I have a choice between a Mercedes, a BMW, and a Land Rover. You're like, I thought we were only going to be able to afford a Toyota. Like, well, these are the 3 that are on the table. Now you're trying to go through like consumer reports, like for what's most reliable, like anybody knows, right? I mean,
Yeah.
So it's proving to be a very exciting time, but a very stressful time. And that's where guys like you come in, because there are certain financial things that you can figure out on your own. You can take a look at what's existingly out there. But when you start getting into the war game, advanced planning, you need someone. I mean, I have someone, right, where you go, hey, look, what assumptions are conservative? What assumptions are outlandish? How do I react to these certain things? Hey, if this didn't go the way I planned, what would that look like, right? Having someone go through those, I call them war games. I don't know what you guys call them, but, and go through those different scenarios and figure out, hey, how do I set my family up in the best situation possible so that if there's a dip, right, or an acceleration or a drop off, any one of those, how do I react? What do I do?
Yeah, perfect. Well, let's get into some of these questions. We've had a few come in. One was, what's the typical timeline, or what should someone expect if they are in that transition from, military to civilian life, right? I mean, is it like, hey, day one, we've got offers on the table because of how much they're hiring, or is there going to be lag time there?
So when we work with folks, and this is military, civilian, doesn't matter, we do a free strategy session before anybody comes in the door. So if you go to our website, there's no pricing and you can't sign up for any services. You have to talk to one of us first. And the reason for that is because you don't want to spend any money or spend any effort or spend any energy doing anything until you know what's the timeline and what's the plan. Now, we do a 15-minute strategy call where we ask a bunch of specific questions. Where are you at? When are you leaving? When does your terminal leave start? Are you getting a full retirement or not, right? Because it's specific to each person. But in that 15-minute call, we narrow it down. Like I said, if you're looking for rough numbers, about 12 months out if you're in a current flying position, about 18 months out if you're not. The first, in a person that's flying, the first 3 months of it is getting your resume, application review, and networking set up and running. The next 3 months is getting your networking and job fair stuff up and running so that 6 months prior to leaving, you're in interviews. If you're in a non-flying position, the first 6 months is really looking at those skill bridge opportunities, and then it goes down the same path. 3 months of resumes, applications, background, whatever, 3 months of networking and job fairs, and then 6 months prior. It's a lot less stressful because you got to remember, when military people go into civilian, there is no PCS, right? So you're trying to move your family, figure out where you're going to go do all this all at once. Imagine if 6 months prior, you knew exactly what the future was going to look like, and you got to enjoy the last 6 months of your time in the military doing stuff with your family, not panicking over how are we going to make a mortgage payment.
Yeah, perfect. And then someone else asked, okay, so you mentioned there are some technical parts of the resume that are less important, some that are more important, really leaning on the relationship. What parts of those, what technical parts are definitely still important rather than like, hey, this is not something we should focus on?
Yeah, so certificates and ratings are really, really important. Right? Do you have an ATP? Do you have a restricted ATP? Do you have any instructor ratings? What type ratings do you have? Do you have the FCC restricted radio telephone operator permit? Do you have a medical? Right? Those things are important. There are certain flight times that are important. It varies. Like got to remember, we have military people that are rotary transition, so their flight times are going to be a little bit different than if you were a fighter pilot. They're going to be a little bit different than if you were a heavy tanker pilot, right? So the flight times are going to be a little bit different, but in general, your total time, your turbine PIC time, your multi-engine time, so on and so forth. Under where we really get the meat in is volunteer experience, professional development. Think about over an entire career, how many things you do to make yourself better at what you do. Some of them done through the organization you worked for, some of them paid for out of your own pocket. Honors and awards. Some of these are formal, some of these are not, right? You have someone write a letter to your chief pilot, that's an honor, right? You know, you have an award, use the military, right? You get people get different awards that are get a certificate and a medal, right? Okay. Volunteer experience. What do you do outside the cockpit in the community? Educational background. And there's a lot of people that have different types of education that are formal, some that are non-formal, some that they can complete, some that they did complete, some they did not complete. As much of that as we can get on there should go on there. And then lastly, underneath their individual jobs, we get it. You flew an airplane. What else did you do? And that's where we get into the teeth pulling, right? That's why that 1 hour interview that we do with people, where we have folks that have seen thousands of people with a background similar to yours, that know the exact right questions to ask, that know all the dark corners of your background to go pull stuff from. We're pulling that stuff out. And it's hilarious because we send people when we write a resume, right? We do a 1 hour interview. We then completely reformat, rewrite the entire resume. We then send them a first draft. Do you know how many people, when they get the first draft, go, you know, that's actually true? You think we were going to do lie, right? But they're like, wow, that's all true. They're like, I would hire that person. Yeah, it's impressive when you think about it, isn't it? But there's all these things that they just take for granted that they did. Mm-hmm. And when we put it on that sheet of paper, they're like, wow, I guess I never looked at it that way. I didn't realize, yeah, that is valuable, isn't it? Like I said, they're like, I can't believe it. That's true. Right? I saw a meme once that there's only one thing more impressive than me, and that's my resume. We don't do that, right? Like everything on the resume is true. But it is creative writing in the sense of figuring out, how did what you do over here have an impact? Mm-hmm. So it's true, but it lays it out in recruiter terms. And so those are, you know, the certificates and ratings and the flight times, people can figure that out on their own. There's no rocket science in that. The professional development, what do you put on? What do you not put on? Because a lot of people have a lot of it. Volunteer experience, what do you put on? What do you not put on? How do you include education that you have that wasn't formal? And how do you show value in each of these jobs? That's where you're getting your bang for your buck with us.
Perfect. Well, we are at the top of the hour. If we did not get to your question, you know, you will be contacted. We will address it. But James, yeah, thank you so much for being on. I mean, you know, you've got an awesome podcast, awesome company. He was on our podcast talking about entrepreneurship, also very insightful just as a business owner and scaling a business. But yeah, thank you so much for being on.
Yeah, man. Thank you very much for having me.
Yeah.
Thank you guys both for giving us all this great information. And on behalf of Advice Chaser, we want to thank both of you, the organizations that we work with to bring you these types of webinars, and to all our attendees for showing up and listening along with us and asking great questions. You can look for an email soon with a link to a replay of the event, and you're welcome to share that with anyone you think would benefit from it. Here at Advice Chaser, we're all about helping you find a financial advisor who is a great fit for your life and your financial questions. Our matching service is free to you, and every one of our advisor partners has committed to offer a free initial consultation to anyone we introduce them to. You can find out more by going to advicechaser.com and clicking on the link to find an advisor. Once again, thanks so much, and we'll see you at another webinar soon.